everyone, welcome back to Tea Time Thoughts. I'm Kaylin as always, and before I get started today, I just wanted to say thank you for the truly overwhelming amount of support that I've received since starting this podcast. All the listens and the nice comments and reviews, they really mean a lot to me, and it just makes me feel good to know that other people are interested in these topics and interested in learning more. And I'm just really excited that this is something that I get to do, because it allows me to carve out time out of my week and research something and be able to get to know bits of history in more detail. So thank you guys for making all of that possible. Anyway, so I also forgot last week, I didn't mention, but I was drinking peppermint tea, which is also what I'm drinking now. It's kind of my go-to classic when it comes to, just wanting something nice and warm to drink and not being able to make up my mind. You really can't go wrong with peppermint tea. And today, we are going to be discussing the Black Plague outbreak from 1347 to 1350. And I figured this would be super original since the coronavirus has entered the group chat and has dominated the group chat for quite a while now. And let's scare ourselves a little. What better way to get our minds off of one epidemic than to discuss another one? So just to get started, we kind of tend to think that this plague, or this particular outbreak of the plague, when we refer to it, we usually call it the plague. So it's the big one that comes to everyone's minds. This is the one that we think of with people having black sores all over their bodies and the pockets full of posy rhymes. But this isn't actually the first time that we've seen plague. And one thing I was surprised to find out is the first instance of plague was actually seen during the Neolithic period, or for those of you that are unfamiliar with what that means, that's the New Stone period. About 5,000 BC or so, which is really incredible. You don't really think about it being that far back, or I don't know, so many of us don't even really comprehend history beyond that time. So that was something that was really fascinating to me. And so this particular outbreak of 1347 to 1350, as many people have speculated, it originated in Asia and it traveled along the Silk Road. And as we know, international travel has a history of transporting illnesses. I mean, one example that we can definitely look at is the Columbian trade bringing syphilis over to Europe. But you know what? At least we got chocolate. So you win some and you lose some. Asia also experienced, before this plague outbreak, they experienced a great deal of natural disasters due to climate change, which was caused by wind patterns in Eurasia changing, and there were also periods of drought and flooding. And so the mice and rats in these areas on the steppes migrated to more populated areas where they had more of a chance of being dry or finding food. And obviously, many of us know that the rats were the hosts for the fleas that were infected with the plague. And when the rats would die, the fleas would look for a new host. And because rats were moving into more populated areas, fleas were able to reach humans in a way that they didn't have as much access before. And as caravans are traveling along the Silk Road, as ships are bringing goods back and forth across Eurasia, a lot of rats are carried over. One of the first places that we see it spread in Europe is in Italy, because Italy was a very big trading center, and it was said that it was spread in Italy by Genoese merchants and traders, and from there it spread outward, and it hit Italy's neighbors like Spain and France, and then from Spain it goes to Portugal. From France it travels across the channel to England, and then Germany and Scotland and Scandinavia are hit. But one thing that I found really interesting during my research too is we focus so much on Europe being hit, and then somewhat on the back burner we have Asia spreading the initial plague, but the Middle East and North Africa were also quite hit by it. We see outbreaks in Cairo that are quite devastating as well, and we know in general that a third of Europe died, and many numbers vary exactly as to how many died, but there's such a huge margin because, we can't know for certain due to lack of records and lack of primary sources, but we say around 80 million to 200 million people died as a result of this epidemic. The social impact of it is a lot more land available because villages are just deserted. A lot of people are abandoning areas that are a bit more crowded in hopes of evading this disease. And economically, we see a huge increase in unemployment, which, interesting, kind of like now. And European trade was also disrupted, and again, interesting, kind of like now. Unemployment during the plague was a result of these deserted villages and cities, and there was also a great disruption for guilds and craftsmen, because if you're not able to trade your work to anybody, if people are leaving, you're losing your customer base. And guilds end up also having to create greater restrictions on who they hire, because if they have so few customers and a small amount of income coming in, they have to pick their most qualified candidates for the jobs. And we're going to see more of the impact of this high rate of unemployment and such when we get to the conclusion of this episode. So getting into the plague itself, there were 3 main types of plague. And the first one, and the most famous one we know, is the bubonic plague. And this is usually caused by flea bites. And, this is the famous one with the buboes and the gangrenous black fingers. And for those that caught this, they had about a 60 to 75% chance of death. Signs of this particular type of plague included fever, vomiting blood, buboes growing on the body, and in Giovanni Boccaccio's The Decameron, which is one of the few primary resources that had been created around this time, he describes specifically the bubo swelling under the armpit and the groin. And what's significant about this particular account that we have from him is it's not just a sort of newspaper or medical report, it's a work of fiction based on very real events. So it's a contemporary account that we can get of the Black Plague, but it's also one that can dig into things on a more human level, because sometimes if we look at sources specifically from the news or reports in medicine, it's not a very empathetic sort of read. There's not a lot of great feeling or desire to evoke emotion in it. So this helps really paint the picture of some of the devastation that was going on during the time. And so the next type of plague is the pneumonic plague, and this spread through the air, like through coughs or sneezes. Interestingly enough, kind of like today, that's why we're all wearing masks when we go out. This infects the lungs, and it's more deadly than the bubonic plague because it has a 90% chance of death. And signs of this would include coughing and respiratory issues and eventually coughing up blood. And usually by the time you were coughing up blood, it was a pretty certain sign that you were going to be dead and going to be dead soon. And now we have the most deadly type, and that's the septicemic plague. That's usually when the blood's infected. So if somebody, happened to cough into an open wound, or if you were caring for somebody perhaps who was infected and you somehow had a sore or some kind of cut and the disease was able to get into it, then that was how you would get it. But this one is especially deadly because there's a 100% chance of death. Usually the signs of it are a high fever and purple patches on the skin, but often this disease would act in about 14 hours, so there wasn't really time for buboes to form, so it would happen so quickly there wouldn't really be time to attempt a proper treatment or anything of the sort. As we know, there was a lot of confusion and concern going on because this was an epidemic that could really affect anybody. Usually we would think the peasants of this time would be the ones to be infected by a disease because they're the ones that are living in their filth. Like people, this triggers my fight or flight syndrome, but people would save stale urine to wash their clothes in it because they believed that it had the best cleansing policy. People are dumping out their waste into the same river that they're drinking from. People are dumping out waste onto the streets and have to walk through it. There's this one documentary I'd recommend if anybody feels a little bit like grossing themselves out. It's called Dirty Cities, and it's about the history, basically just how straight up filthy London was. And one gentleman went to a public latrine and the wood was so rotten that he died because this toilet essentially broke and he drowned in the waste below. Anyway, now that I've probably scared a few listeners off or upset anyone who was having lunch or even a cup of tea, I'm looking at my cup right now and, I'm just gonna give it a little bit before I get back to it. But as I was saying, this is a disease that transcends age, transcends class, it transcends gender. It would really affect just about anybody. So before we see people that work for the church in Europe getting infected, the first assumption that people usually have is, oh, well, God is punishing us for something. Because the medieval view of God is a particularly interesting one. It's essentially that God is at the top, and then you have angels, then you have people, then you have animals, then you have plants, and then you have rocks. So humans, while not on the very bottom, they're still separated from God. And God is a very vengeful and angry God. I think in a lot of ways they viewed him as an Old Testament God because your position in life, everything was granted by him. So if you did anything so much to try to advance your position or go against the norm or even like disobey your husband or not want to pay a high tax to your feudal lord or the church, you're disobeying the order of things. And therefore you're disappointing God. And therefore you're ruining your chances at heaven. So that was the first assumption for a lot of people that, oh, we've disappointed God. And so we see a great turn towards religion during this time. A lot of people are looking at ways that they can punish themselves. So some people will participate in flagellation or whipping themselves and wearing hair shirts that are especially scratchy and uncomfortable. And people will wear these sacred amulets and pray. A lot of people will try to pray to certain saints or get their hands on specific religious artifacts. Because one thing that's really interesting, and especially something that we see Martin Luther kind of battling against within the next 200 years or so, is this obsession with relics in the church. Some corrupt people within the church, or even just people that were trying to make some money, would play on the fear that people in this time had of God. So people would sell pieces of wood claiming it was broken off bits of the cross. They would sell body parts from saints, like here is St. Edmund's nail parings, here is the ankle bone of St. John or something. People even went so far as to sell vials of what they claimed to be the Virgin Mary's breast milk. We look at this and this is just so bizarre to us. We're like, obviously that's not only totally fake, but why would you need something like this? But to them during this time, in your short life, you need to do what you can to show God that you're loyal and God that you're valuing what he's given you. And once we start to see members of the church, like nuns or monks, starting to get infected with the plague, it kind of creates some questioning as to the purpose of the plague. For a lot of people, they still view it as a religious reason, but also people are like, well, why would God be punishing his own workers? There's got to be something really terribly wrong. As I said earlier, the aftermath of the plague is the loss of about a third of the population of Europe and also a third of the population of the Middle East. We see very populated cities just decimated, and they're not going to be able to surpass the population that they had before the plague for centuries to come. People that have survived it, people that have buried loved ones or have had to abandon jobs and homes that they love or occupations that would feed them, people want answers to why this could have happened. So we see a lot of confusion in regards to religion, and people either use that religion to be the foundation of their cause and persecution of others. One thing we really see in particular after the outbreak of the plague is persecution of Jewish people. A lot of people believed that Jews were seen as instigators of disaster, like the Black Death. They thought that the Jews went and poisoned the wells, and less Jewish people died due to their own sanitary habits. They have a belief that they need to wash their hands before they partake of bread. And as we mentioned earlier, medieval Europe is filthy. It's just straight up messy and completely unsanitary. So it makes sense that someone who's going to be a bit more aware of their hygiene is going to be safer. But obviously this isn't going to be something that really sinks in with them. I mean, heck, they used to believe that baths were dangerous because not only were you naked and vulnerable to the devil, but open pores would let in disease. So, people would have occasionally put on like a nice protective layer of dirt or something over their pores to keep everything sealed up. And so the Jewish people become a scapegoat for a lot of people that are questioning what's going on during this time. Many of them are forced to convert to Christianity in order to avoid being persecuted. And there are instances of great public burnings where Jewish people that don't convert over, they're thrown into this big fire. And there's an account that I read in my Renaissance and Reformation class while I was in school, that people would be pulling babies or children from the arms of parents that were about to be executed because they were going to enact this plan to raise the children in the Christian faith. These actions, we think about it, we think, well, obviously this isn't going to fix anything. This isn't going to be able to reverse the plague. And above all, it's such an inhumane and terrible thing to do. It's an awful thing to, single out a group of people and blame them as the instigators of a certain problem or a certain issue. But people were so desperate to win favor with God and be able to kind of restore life to normal that people are willing to take these actions. And Jewish people weren't alone in this. A lot of people thought that foreigners or immigrants would have something to do with it, and people that had leprosy were targeted as well, and even some monks and pilgrims were targeted, because some people are out here theorizing that, well, if God is targeting all of us and even targeting members of the church, then there must be something wrong with these people. They must have done something wrong to bring God's anger upon us, so it's their fault. And it's so tragic to see people come out of one really horrific epidemic and their first reaction is to ensue more tragedy, to enact terrible, hateful crimes against other people. But thankfully there were, I guess, some bright spots in the aftermath. Because so many people had died and because so much land had been cleared up, the peasant class was basically able to rally for higher wages and better land conditions, and some people were even able to go and claim abandoned lands. And this effectively replaces the old feudal system. We start to see landowners taking on tenants and charging them rent rather than the old feudal system where a knight or a lord would own land and you'd have peasants living on the land and growing their crops and farming the land, and then they would pay a good sum of their harvest to their feudal lord, and the knights and lords would basically offer protection in exchange for the services of these people. But, as we can see too, in some cases, the knights aren't always going to offer the protection that they should. In some cases, they take advantage of the peasants. There are some sources where some peasants approach their lords and they request such basic rights, like being able to go out into the nearby woods and pick firewood, and to have a bishop of the local clergy who is from the church and didn't just kind of get the position to make money and is just kind of there to have the job, not there because he's a God-fearing man who is going to help members of the congregation find some kind of salvation or some kind of reconciliation with God. And again, you look at this and it seems so small, but people that were in charge, people that had the power, they were like, no, that's ridiculous. I don't want to give that up. Like, what are you really doing for me? And think about how much you need me. So to have this switch where there's a monetary tie between landlords and peasants, it creates a solution for this previous power struggle. So landowners, take on tenants and charge them rent, and people essentially, it's not quite ownership of the land that they have, but it's more freedom than they had before. Of course, there's a downside to this too, because after this we begin to see a rise in rural and urban violence against former masters to claim territories or possessions. A lot of noble people are persecuted afterwards, or a lot of noble houses or properties are raided for whatever things have been left behind during this frenzy to get out and escape to somewhere that maybe the plague wouldn't get you. And we start to see social rebellions across Europe, like the Wat Tyler revolts, where peasants are demanding higher wages because if there's less of them to do the same jobs as before, then they deserve more money for more work. And we see a lot of people being executed as a result of these rebellions. We see a lot of pushback. Wat Tyler, for instance, was executed for stirring up these people. But it's just an instance of violence being fought with violence, because Wat Tyler is stirring people to overthrow their masters and kill them and just take charge themselves. So it's hard because there's a desire to change, and for the first time in a while that there is more of an opportunity to change, but it's still coming at a very high cost. And on the bright side, though, it's after the fading of the plague and after this disaster that the road is really paved for the incoming Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation, because people are becoming more aware, and because systems of life are changing, people are going to be a bit more open-minded about what their lives can be, about what religion can be. This leads to a rise in thoughtfulness. It leads to a rise in humanism and humanistic thinking, and it reattaches people to their lives as an individual and not just a little creature that God threw on earth. It leads to an interest in humanity in all its forms, and these ideas really spread in the Renaissance and in the Reformation. One example you can really see this manifested in is in medieval art versus Renaissance art. A lot of medieval art is religious in nature, and we've seen some just ridiculous images of people standing in the doorway of a castle, and they're basically as big as the whole castle would be, because we don't have the sort of carefully mapped out perspectives that we see in Renaissance art. And this wasn't that people didn't know how to create art. It wasn't that they weren't talented in an artistic way. It's that if God created man and you portray it in some way, that if it in some way shames humanity as a creation, then in essence, you're making light of God's creation. You're disrespecting it. And due to this overwhelming fear of God and his rage during this time, we don't see a great or grand improvement in art. And there's been a lot of debate over whether or not, the Dark Ages should be referred to as dark, because there's still artistic innovation going on. There's still people advocating for more of an individualized religion, but they just don't have the means to spread what they're learning in a way that they would have been able to a few centuries later, when it comes to new technology like the invention of the printing press and movable typesettings. Anyway, so we really start to see this notion of humanity and humanism and this idealization of the human form when the Renaissance takes place. And at the earliest, people estimate the beginning date of the Renaissance is 1350, and it begins in Italy, which is so interesting because this is very shortly after the plague has taken place, and it's in the place that the plague had originated in Europe. So we see from the European birthplace of the plague, we also get the birthplace of the European Renaissance, and it's just fascinating. And again, Renaissance art, in comparison to this medieval art, we're seeing a great deal of mathematical proportions coming into play, specifically with Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. Not only is this man mathematically proportionate, but Da Vinci also intended for the proportions of this man to also be applicable to architecture. So man is a method of measurement for all things in the earth, which is absolutely incredible when you think about the medieval mindset that man is basically nothing to man is wonderful, and man is capable of so many great things. And crazy enough, all of this wonderful change in thought in some way is owed to the plague, to the Black Death. And I will certainly be interested in talking more about the Renaissance and the Reformation, because they're two topics that are very interesting, and they have really significant ties to history as we know it and the modern age as we know it as well. But for right now, before I kind of end things, I thought it would be fun to look up some interesting cures that people of the time had for the plague. Now, just because it's called a cure doesn't necessarily mean that it worked per se. It was what people believed to have worked. And we already discussed some religious cures like whipping and praying and wearing amulets and purchasing relics. But I'm going to look at more somewhat medicinal cures. And I'm going to start with some relatively normal-ish ones, and we're going to work our way down to some stuff that's quite interesting. So one of the most basic cures was thought to, wash with vinegar or to sweat out the disease. This is kind of based on the ideology of the four humors, and bleeding was also considered a cure at the time. people thought that you could sweat out the disease or bleed out the disease because the disease would be let out with your fluids. And some people thought that because the disease was bad, that it would be attracted to bad. So some people would be instructed to sit by a sewer or in a place that's just especially smelly, and the disease will travel out of your body and go along with the smell because it's basically like it recognizes a friend, and it's like, okay, I'm going to peace out now. Good luck with everything. And another one along this line was to use pieces of a chopped up snake and rub it on the buboes because the snake represents evil, and the evil disease will therefore be attracted to the evil snake and be drawn out. And oh boy, this next one is interesting. So another cure that people believed would work was the chicken cure. And so you would take a chicken and pluck it of all of its feathers. You don't kill it. It's important that the chicken stays alive for this. So this plucked chicken would be held up to the swollen lymph nodes of the infected person. And basically they wait for the chicken to get sick because they thought the chicken would be drawing the disease away. And you basically keep this up until either the chicken dies or until you die. So just remember that correlation doesn't equal causation. If somebody did get better from that, I wouldn't say that. I don't know. You know what? Maybe it did work. Maybe the next time I get, a sore throat, I'll go to Big Five or something and like go buy a chick and, just let it chill on me for a bit until I feel better. Who knows? So if you were more wealthy, you could afford some cures such as drinking crushed gems, but a more budget-friendly version of this would be drinking a combination of mercury or arsenic, which, surprise, didn't work because you would die, but if you were drinking this in prevention of the plague, I guess technically it would work because if you're dead, then you can't catch the plague. Oh, man. And one thing I found particularly interesting was ground unicorn powder was supposed to be a very effective drug against this disease. However, it was very difficult to obtain because unicorns, they believed, could only be drawn out by a peaceful virgin maid. And it was also difficult to get because unicorns aren't real. So when I read a bit about this, they, after they listed unicorn horn as when they listed it as a potential treatment, and then they said physicians had a difficult time getting a hold of this, all I could think was, well, yeah, because where are you gonna go see a unicorn? Where are you gonna go find one? And say you do find one, how are you getting the horn? I mean, I guess it's just hunting at that point. Anyway, and then the pièce de résistance. A medieval person sure has a lot of uses for human waste, so maybe that would work. As far as how exactly it was used, I'm not going into further detail on that because I think I've already disgusted enough of us for a while in talking about just how filthy Europe really was. I'd like to leave us all with some peace of mind. But I will give you one more quick fun fact as far as cures. So Venice actually enacted some sorts of social distancing once they recognized that infected people could spread the plague to others. They enforced a amount of isolation periods, which varied from about 30 days to 40 days. And this, obviously was more effective. And if we see, there's a map that I saw once where they map out like the hot spots of the plague, and there are some spots in Italy that aren't as terribly affected. It could be due to something like this, but it also could be due to the fact that in Milan, once they noticed that somebody was exhibiting symptoms, they just burned their whole house down, which I guess works, but wow. Anyway, so that's a little bit about the Black Plague for you, and if you guys have any requests for upcoming episodes, feel free to leave comments or reviews with some topics you'd like to see. I'm really interested in hearing your guys' suggestions because there are some topics that I'm passionate about and enjoy talking about, but I also would love to take the opportunity to learn more about what you guys enjoy and be able to participate in a meaningful discussion with you. And before I go, I just wanted to say thank you again to those of you that have left reviews. It means a lot to me, and it really helps boost the podcast. And if you're interested in leaving a review, please do. Please comment. It really does help us reach more listeners that are also interested in these sort of subjects. And depending on what platform you're using to listen to this, if you're interested in subscribing, that would mean a lot to me. Anyway, thank you guys. I'll talk to you all next Tuesday. And this is Tea Time Thoughts, and I'm Kaylin as always. Thanks.